They called it a beautification project. To me, it looked like bulldozers tearing through 6 decades of my grandmother's rose garden as if it were nothing more than a patch of weeds in their way. One moment I was sipping coffee on a porch, and the next, I was watching million-dollar homeowners shooting me dirty looks like I'd parked a junkyard in their dream neighborhood. In their eyes, my land was an eyesore, breaking up the visual harmony of their pristine enclave and apparently upsetting the emotional balance of their designer labradoodles. It's funny no one seemed bothered while Grandma was alive, but now that a single, not-so-wealthy guy owns 5 acres in their carefully curated paradise, I've suddenly become the local menace. Ever had someone smile at you while plotting to erase your existence behind your back? If so, you'll understand. What they didn't count on was that some roots run deeper than any property line, and some people won't roll over just because a homeowners association prints threats on shiny brochures. I've always had a respect for boundaries. Comes with the job. I'm a GIS specialist mapping land, analyzing data, understanding how every parcel connects to the next. So the irony wasn't lost on me when my own property lines became the battleground of the biggest fight I'd ever face. I'm Nathan Collins, I'm 38, and until recently, life was quiet. I worked remotely from my Portland apartment and dreamed of building a house one day on the land my grandmother left me. When she passed at 92, she entrusted me with 5 acres that had been in our family for more than 60 years. This wasn't just land, it was the place where I learned to fish in the small lake, where I helped her prune her beloved roses, and where I decided someday I'd settle for good. I remember one summer, burnt out from work, I came out just to help her in the garden, not because I had to but because the air was cleaner, and her smile somehow made everything feel lighter. She used to say, "Land doesn't just belong to you, Nathan. If you care for it long enough, it starts taking care of you." Back then, it sounded like sentimental old wisdom. Now I realize it was a warning. The property sat about 20 minutes outside Portland, in what was once rural farmland, but that was changing fast. Upscale developments were moving in. 3 sides of Grandma's property now bordered Valley View Estates, a gated community of luxury homes. I had just finished clearing some overgrowth around the old cabin when a sleek black Range Rover rolled up my gravel path. A woman in her early 40s stepped out, wearing designer sunglasses and the kind of poise only money breeds. "Mr. Collins, I'm Eleanor Winters, president of the Valley View Estates HOA," she said. "I'd like to have a word about your land." Her smile was polished, but her eyes were already scanning everything with calculating precision. Inside the cabin, she sipped coffee from one of Grandma's old chipped mugs, in amusing contrast to her polished appearance, and laid out what she described as a generous proposal. "The HOA wanted to buy my land to expand their development." She slid a folder across the table. "We're prepared to offer $300,000, she said. I didn't need to look inside. "That's well below market value," I replied. "This land has been in my family for generations. I plan to build here." Her smile faltered just slightly. "I understand sentimental value, Nathan, but you have to admit, your grandmother's place is quaint. Valley View has certain expectations. In its current state, your property affects the look of our community and that impacts home values." She tapped the folder. "Think about it. $300,000 could get you something much more manageable." We ended the conversation politely enough. She left her card, along with a not-so-subtle invitation to consider a practical option. I didn't realize at the time, that was only her opening move. Within days, things began to shift. The neighborly smiles disappeared. Construction trucks mysteriously blocked my driveway more than once. County surveyors suddenly showed up, citing a need to check boundary markers due to some supposed discrepancies. But when I contacted the county, there was no such request on file. Then, one morning, I noticed several of my property stakes had been shifted by about 8 feet into land that was clearly mine, confirmed by every document I possessed. I was collecting mail at the end of the drive when I overheard Eleanor's voice from across the street. She sat at a cafe-copyright table with an elderly man I later identify as Howard Pierce, a retired real estate attorney and HOA board member. "The access road workaround is perfect," she said, not realizing I was in earshot. "He can keep the land. He just won't be able to use it." Howard looked uneasy but nodded. I ducked away before they spotted me, heart pounding. Whatever scheme they were cooking up, I knew I had to act quickly. I had no idea how fast they'd move. 2 days later, after a morning filled with back-to-back virtual meetings, I drove out to check the property only to see it. 3 massive construction vehicles parked across the access road. Workers were actively tearing up the only driveway connecting my land to the main road. I hit the brakes and jumped out. "What's going on here?" I asked the man in charge, a foreman in a hard hat. He barely acknowledged me, eyes on his clipboard. "Road repair and boundary realignment, road restoration and boundary realignment," the supervisor said flatly, handing me a document bearing an official-looking county seal. "This is my private access road," I snapped, scanning the paper. He shrugged. "Not according to the new survey. This section now belongs to Valley View Estates. Take it up with them if it's a problem." Behind him, a backhoe roared to life, tearing into a 20-foot stretch of driveway that had connected my family to this land for decades. By late afternoon, I was sitting in the modest but purposeful office of Sarah Rodriguez, a local attorney known for going head-to-head with developers. Her space wasn't flashy, and neither was she, but she had the reputation of someone who didn't flinch. "They've been laying the groundwork for weeks," Sarah muttered as she flipped through the documents I'd brought. "The HOA filed for easement revisions last month, claiming the original property lines were inaccurate. This new survey, it's a power play. They redrew the boundaries to cut you off." Her eyes met mine, sharp and serious. "They're trying to box you in, force a sale on their terms." By day's end, she had filed an emergency injunction, and a judge temporarily halted further construction, but Eleanor adapted fast. Within days, residents of Valley View received urgent flyers warning about declining property values and community degradation. I got my hands on one thanks to Jason Kent, a homeowner near my boundary line. Jason had always been decent and more observant than most. "They're rallying the neighborhood against you," he whispered at the local hardware store, glancing around like we were in a spy film. "Eleanor's telling everyone your place is slashing their home values by 15%. She's encouraging complaints to the county." True to his word, county inspectors came by 3 times that week, responding to anonymous reports about hazardous structures and supposed environmental risks. But the injunction had slowed things down, at least for now. Then came Eleanor's next move. 3 weeks later, construction crews arrived again, and not to tear up the road this time, but to build. A 6-foot decorative stone wall began rising along the property line, a supposed community beautification project. Its placement was no accident. It sealed off the narrow maintenance path I'd been using since my driveway was destroyed. When I tried to protest, the county office replied that the wall was entirely on Valley View's land. Legally, they were in the clear. In 2 weeks, the wall was finished. My property was now fully enclosed, save for a narrow strip of wetland useless for bringing in supplies. On a rainy Tuesday, Eleanor's Range Rover appeared again. I was waist-deep in mud, struggling to haul a generator across the soggy field. "This arrangement isn't sustainable for you, Nathan," she said, arms crossed as she watched me strain. The next morning, I found a heap of construction debris dumped just inside my property. Broken concrete, twisted rebar, splintered wood. I filed a complaint. The county dismissed it. "No actionable violation," the inspector said. As I cleared the mess, something metallic glinted beneath the rubble. A small, mud-caked box. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were some of my grandmother's old papers, deeds, county correspondence, and a set of survey maps. One document stood out. The original property deed, with a section highlighted in faded yellow. The legal language was dense, but one phrase leapt off the page: perpetual, unobstructed access. My grandmother hadn't just left me land, she left me leverage. The next day, Eleanor returned. No pleasantries this time. "The HOA has authorized me to make one final offer," she said coolly. $250,000. When I stared at her, stunned, she smiled thinly. "You may want to consider it quickly. I've heard the water and power lines in this area are unstable. Would be unfortunate if you experienced prolonged outages." She handed me a business card. The offer amount scrawled on the back. "You have 48 hours. I called Sarah right away. They're threatening utilities now, she sighed, heavy and frustrated. We expected this. The courts move slow, and they're banking on exhausting you before we get there. That night, I sat in the quiet, staring at a photo of my grandmother on the mantel. I was beginning to question whether this land, this legacy, was worth the war it had become. Then my phone rang. It was Mabel Johnson, Grandma's oldest friend. "Heard you're having trouble with those Valley View vultures," she said without hesitation. I hadn't told her a thing, but in a small town, word travels fast. "Your grandmother fought off developers before, you know," she added. "For decades, they tried to get her land." Mabel's voice grew stronger. "But your grandmother always said, a land is the only thing they're not making more of, Nathan. Once you sell it, it's gone forever. She never let those vultures win. And neither should you." At first light, I was hunched over the kitchen table, surrounded by my grandmother's papers, eyes burning from a night spent poring over them. The clause in the original deed was clear. When she sold off parts of her 20-acre farm in the 1960s, she had retained perpetual and unobstructed access to the remaining parcel via the Eastern Access Road. The clause further stated that those rights would remain with the property regardless of who owned the surrounding land or how it was developed. I called Sarah immediately. She answered, groggy but alert. After I explained what I'd found, there was a long pause. "This could change everything," she said. "Meet me at the county records office when they open. Bring everything." The records office was a drab building filled with tired-looking civil servants, clearly not used to clients rushing in with urgency. "We need all historical documents related to the Collins property and its adjacent parcels," Sarah said to the clerk at the front desk. The clerk returned, looking uncomfortable. "That particular binder was checked out earlier this morning," she mumbled. Sarah's voice sharpened. "By who?" No response, only silence, and the low hum of the security camera above us. Undeterred, we dove into hours of research. While Sarah pored over legal filings, I used my GIS background to compare historical maps against the latest survey documents. Slowly, the truth came into focus. Not only did my deed include access rights, it also covered water rights to the stream that fed the nearby lake, along with a 15-foot easement along the eastern boundary. More damning was our discovery that Eleanor's newly filed survey had intentionally shifted boundary markers to contradict the original property lines. "They knew," I muttered, connecting the dots. "They knew all along and tried to bury it by submitting that bogus survey." Sarah nodded grimly. "This isn't their first time playing dirty, but now we have what we need for the judge." That afternoon, Sarah filed new paperwork, and the court granted us an emergency hearing for the following week. As we stepped out of the courthouse, a rare feeling crept over me. Hope. The powerless fog that had hung over me for weeks was lifting, replaced by determination. My grandmother had prepared for this long ago. She hadn't just passed down land, she'd passed down a legacy of resistance. That evening, Jason Kent showed up at my rental apartment, visibly anxious. "I need to tell you something," he said, glancing over his shoulder like someone might be following him. "I overheard Eleanor during the home meeting last night. Turns out, she used to work for Westlake Development, the same company that tried to buy your grandmother's land 15 years ago. When she wouldn't sell, Eleanor missed out on a major promotion. This isn't just business for here, it's personal." Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't just about expanding Valley View. This was Eleanor trying to settle a grudge that had been festering for years. At the emergency hearing's deposition, we gathered in Sarah's office conference room. Eleanor didn't appear, but her legal proxy, Howard Piercia, and HOA board member, fidgeted nervously under Sarah's questions. "The road work was done to correct historical boundary issues," he said. "And who told the board that?" Sarah asked. Howard hesitated. "Eleanor provided the new survey." Sarah slid a document toward him. "Is this the meeting transcript from March 10th? Howard scanned it and nodded. She tapped a highlighted section. "Please read that aloud." He swallowed. "EW confirms Phase 2 of property isolation strategy to begin next week. Access points A and B to be addressed first." He looked up, pale. "Yeah, I wasn't at that meeting." It didn't matter. The damage was done. We had proof. They were deliberately trying to isolate my land. That night, I returned to my grandmother's journals, flipping through decades of her meticulous notes. She'd met with attorneys, surveyors, and land use consultants over the years, anticipating exactly the kind of maneuvering Eleanor was attempting now. She hadn't just been wise, she'd been strategic. Every clause in her deed, every note in her journal, was a defense against this very battle. And now, I wasn't just reacting, I was fighting back. With her foresight and my expertise, I was building a strategy of my own. The day before the hearing, I got a text from Jason. Emergency home meeting tonight. Eleanor's freaking out. Hours later, I drove past the Valley View clubhouse and saw Eleanor and Howard locked in a heated exchange outside. Her arms flailed, her face was red, her voice raised. As I rolled by, I caught a single line carried on the breeze. He found the clause, we need to move to Plan B immediately, before he figures out what else is in there. What else was in the deed? That night, I sat back down at the kitchen table, documents spread before me, determined to find the answer. At the preliminary hearing the next morning, the full scope of my grandmother's legal foresight began to come into focus. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a calm but commanding presence, listened intently to arguments from both sides before delivering her decision. I'm delaying a final ruling pending further review, she announced. However, there are serious concerns about the HOA's conduct that demand closer examination. A temporary injunction would remain in place, preventing any further restrictions on my property access until the full hearing. It wasn't a total victoria, but it was enough. I saw the flash of disbelief and rage on Eleanor's face. That alone made it clear, we'd struck a serious blow. Outside the courthouse, Sarah gave my arm a firm squeeze. This is just the beginning, she said. They're going to hit back, hard. She was right. What I hadn't anticipated was just how ruthless that counterattack would be, or how close I'd come to losing everything before uncovering my grandmother's most powerful legal safeguard. The next assault came overnight, in the form of a glossy flyer distributed to every doorstep in Valley View and surrounding neighborhoods. My photo, taken without my knowledge, was featured beside bold red text, "Safety Alert. Dangerous individual threatening community values." The flyer portrayed me as a volatile recluse with a grudge, citing fabricated incidents and supposed complaints to law enforcement. At the bottom was my personal contact information, my phone number and the address of my temporary rental. By noon, I'd received dozens of anonymous threats. My car had been vandalized, to get out was scratched deep into the paint. When I called the police, the responding officer barely looked up from his notepad. "Sounds like you've stirred up a lot of people," he said, uninterested. "Might be time to consider moving on before things get worse." That afternoon, the blows kept coming. An email from my employer arrived. Administrative leave pending investigation. The false rumors had reached my job. My income vanished overnight. The weight of legal fees grew heavier. "They're trying to isolate you," Sarah said when I told her. "Classic intimidation tactic. Break your support system, force you to walk away." But even her tone lacked the certainty I'd come to rely on. The next day, she called again, this time with worse news. "Our judge has recused herself," she said. "Conflict of interest. We've been reassigned Nita Broken Bar to Judge William Foster." Her silence said what she didn't have to. Foster was well known in legal circles, often siding with developers. In the past 3 years, he'd ruled against individual property owners 8 times. The odds had just turned sharply against us. The morning of the rescheduled hearing, I woke to heavy pounding on my door. 2 uniformed officers stood outside. "Nathan Collins, you're under arrest for criminal trespassing and vandalism on Valley View Estates property." They presented grainy security footage of someone vaguely resembling me, slicing through decorative fencing at 3 a.m. the night before. I'd been fast asleep in my apartment. "This is doctored," I protested. "Tell it to the judge," one officer said, already turning to lead me out. I spent 6 hours in a holding cell before Sarah managed to post bail. When I got home, my apartment had been searched, drawers overturned, papers scattered. And the worst part? It was perfectly legal, thanks to the arrest. Judge Foster reviewed our evidence with visible disinterest during the hearing, nodding along to the HOA's statements while scrutinizing every word we offered. That evening, I returned to find my power and water shut off, maintenance delays cited as the cause. with repairs scheduled for several weeks. I sat in the dark, my phone flashlight casting a weak circle of light on the ceiling. I called Sarah. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," I said quietly. "They're taking everything." She didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, she said, "Nathan, maybe it's time to try a different approach." I didn't understand. "They expect us to keep fighting the same way," she continued. "What if we do the opposite? What if we make them think they've already won?" Her plan was bold or risky. Even, I would withdraw the lawsuit, pretend to concede, and act as if their campaign of pressure had broken me. Meanwhile, we'd gather evidence of their conduct as stronger ammunition for our final counterattack. The next morning, I submitted a formal letter to the HOA board stating my intent to withdraw the legal challenge and begin negotiations to sell. Within hours, Eleanor called me personally. Her voice oozed triumph. "I'm glad you've come to your senses, Nathan," she said. "We'll prepare final paperwork." $200,000. The offer had dropped again, another power move. I didn't flinch. "I just want this to be over," I replied, injecting defeat into my tone. "I'll need a few days to clear out my grandmother's things." "Of course," she replied, graciously. "Take until the weekend. We'll sign Monday morning." What she didn't know was that Jason had offered me temporary refuge in his guest house. From there, we launched the next phase of the plan. Predictably, Eleanor couldn't resist celebrating. She organized a party at the Valley View Clubhouse, inviting key stakeholders and board members to toast their supposed victory. What none of them knew was that Jason had installed discreet recording devices inside the clubhouse the night before. As I listened to the live feed from his guest house, Eleanor's voice rang out, giddy and self-assured. "The new commercial development will triple our initial investment," she boasted. And then the evidence we needed must have began to spill. Once Eleanor began boasting about leveling the eyesore property and draining the small lake, the room buzzed with anticipation. "It'll give us prime real estate for the shopping complex," she announced. Amana Howard spoke up cautiously. "What about the environmental concerns?" "The wetlands?" Eleanor let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Handled. Our friends at the county have already smoothed it over." By the end of the evening, we had it all on tape. Admissions of falsified reports, bribery, property rights violations, all laid out in Eleanor's own words. It was enough not just for a new judge, but for a new prosecutor. When we played the recording back later, her voice felt like a hammer blow. "Once we level that lake, prime real estate for the shopping complex." That sentence alone made the entire scheme crystal clear. Sarah wasted no time. She took the audio straight to the district attorney, bypassing local police entirely. Within 48 hours, the criminal charges against me were dropped, and the DA opened a formal investigation into Eleanor. "This proves deliberate falsification," Sarah said as we reviewed our next steps. "But more importantly, it gives us leverage. A new, stronger lawsuit." We launched a comprehensive legal counterattack. Every instance of harassment, every manipulated report, every access denial, we documented it all. This time, we named names: the HOA, Eleanor herself, and several county officials complicit in her actions. Then, the media took notice. Carmen Washington, a no-nonsense investigative journalist known for exposing shady development deals, approached us. "I've been tracking disputes like this for years," she said during our first meeting. "But your case, this one has teeth." Her article, "A Property Rights Nightmare, Developers Vendetta Exposed," pulled no punches. It highlighted Eleanor's repeated use of intimidation, misinformation, and backdoor deals to pressure holdout property owners. The story went viral, drawing attention from a state senator advocating property rights reform. Once the article quoted Eleanor bragging about her county contacts and rigged reports, public backlash came fast and loud. The HOA board scrambled. An emergency meeting turned into chaos as members demanded answers. "You told us this was just a routine boundary issue," one board member shouted. "Now we're all being sued." The wall of support Eleanor had carefully built began crumbling. Board members distanced themselves, and Jason, still our inside source, reported that at least 3 had sought independent legal counsel. Then came a moment I hadn't expected. One rainy evening, someone knocked on the guest house door. It was Howard Pierce. He stood soaked, shoulders slumped, I need to talk, he said, voice low. Not as Eleanor's lawyer, as someone who can't keep covering this up. For 2 hours, he laid everything out. Eleanor had blackmailed him into compliance, threatening to expose past ethical violations that could ruin his career. She's been pulling strings like this for years, he said. But this time, she's gone too far. I'll testify about all of it, the fake surveys, the targeted blockades, every dirty move. But Howard didn't come empty-handed. He brought files, real documentation showing Eleanor had used these same tactics in 3 prior developments. Sarah and I pored over the records, and that's when we found what truly terrified Eleanor. Not just the access clause I had uncovered, but something buried deeper. A community access reversion clause. My grandmother had anticipated this exact situation. Hidden in the original deed was a provision stating that if access to the Collins property was ever intentionally obstructed by adjacent development, ownership of critical common areas including Valley View's main entrance and its central park would revert to the Collins family. It was a nuclear option. Sarah immediately set to work, detailing every access violation. I used my GIS experience to map original boundaries, trace every blocked path, and overlay it with current construction. Together, we built a timeline of photos, records, witness statements. We didn't just have a case, we had a weapon. Then, something unexpected arrived. An unmarked envelope containing internal HOA financials. Eleanor had been siphoning development funds into personal accounts. The note inside said, "Not everyone on the board agrees with what's happening. Ready for the real trap. Trigger the reversion clause." The counterattack was nearly ready, but Eleanor wasn't finished, not yet. As the tide began to turn against her, Eleanor abruptly changed tactics. Through an intermediary, she extended what she framed as a peace offering. "Eleanor is prepared to restore your access road as a gesture of goodwill," the message read. "She hopes this matter can be resolved amicably, without further legal action." Sarah saw right through it. "She's scared," she said bluntly. "She finally understands what that reversion clause means for Valley View. It was a strategic opening and we planned to use it." We agreed I would meet Eleanor in person, equipped with a concealed recorder, to see what more she might reveal before we set our final move in motion. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a quiet conference room at the public library. Eleanor showed up with 2 HOA board members, but conspicuously, not Howard. Her absence of swagger was immediately noticeable. The once dominant developer now projected an air of calm reason. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," she began, her smile tight. "The board has agreed to restore full access to your property immediately." At first, it seemed like a textbook attempt at damage control, but as the meeting went on and Eleanor grew more comfortably, perhaps thinking she was back in control, the mask began to slip. When one board member stepped out to take a phone call, Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low but confident. "Once this is smoothed over and you sell, which you eventually will, we'll move forward with the commercial zone as planned. That lake of yours is perfect for parking lot drainage." The other board member nodded in agreement. "We've already secured the environmental variances," he added casually. They had no idea they were being recorded. The very next morning, Carmen Washington published her most explosive article yet. Caught on tape. Developer admits to environmental manipulation in Valley View dispute. The piece featured direct quotes from the recording, exposing Eleanor's ongoing scheme. By noon, local environmental groups had announced formal investigations into potential wetland violations. The county commissioner's office issued a statement distancing itself from all permitting decisions related to the project. The public backlash was swift and unrelenting. Valley View residents, now concerned not just about their property values but their reputations, flooded the HOA with demands for Eleanor's immediate removal. The chaos gave us the perfect window to strike. Sarah filed our motion to trigger the reversion clause first thing the next morning, submitting it to a newly assigned judge known for strict interpretations of property law. Our filing included ironclad documentation, access violations, sworn testimony from Howard, time-stamped photographs, and the damning audio recordings. The court quickly scheduled an emergency hearing, and until then, all development activity in the contested areas was frozen. When Eleanor tried to send in construction crews to cut down trees along my property linea likely to destroy physical boundary markers, the sheriff's department stepped in, warning her that further interference could result in criminal charges. The emergency hearing was held in a packed courtroom. The gallery was filled with Valley View residents, many of whom now looked at Eleanor with open hostility, a stark contrast to just weeks earlier. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Martina Reynolds, known for her rigorous attention to detail. When Eleanor's newly hired attorney tried to argue that the reversion clause was outdated and unenforceable, Reynolds cut him off. This clause was properly registered with the county and has gone unchallenged for 43 years, she said firmly. Its language is explicit. After just 2 hours of testimony and argument, Judge Reynolds delivered her ruling. The court finds clear and convincing evidence of deliberate and systematic obstruction of legal access to the Collins property. According to the terms of the 1967 deed, control of the specified common areas shall revert to Mr. Collins effective immediately. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Residents of Valley View looked around in disbelief, slowly realizing what this meant. The main entrance boulevard and Central Park area, the very features that gave their development its prestige, and now legally belonged to me. Eleanor's face turned ghostly pale as the judge continued. Furthermore, the court finds evidence suggestive of potential criminal misconduct concerning falsified surveys and permits. I am referring these matters to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Sarah handled the questions expertly, while I maintained a composed silence. The headlines the following days said it all. David defeats Goliath in property rights showdown. HOA loses key areas in stunning legal upset. Valley View plunged into panic. Overnight, property listings were updated to reflect uncertain access rights, and home values began to plummet. In desperation, the HOA called an emergency meeting, but it quickly devolved into chaos as enraged homeowners demanded accountability for the disaster they now faced. The emergency home meeting quickly spiraled into chaos. What happens to our homes now? One resident shouted. Can he block our access completely? Another demanded. Eleanor tried to maintain control, but her authority was crumbling. Every attempt to speak was met with interruptions and rising anger. When she finally suggested that temporary inconvenience might be necessary while the board challenged the court's ruling, Jason Kent stood up. This is entirely your doing, Eleanor, he said firmly, his former fear gone. You turned this into a personal vendetta against Nathan Collins, and now we're all paying the price. It was the first time a resident had openly called her out, and it broke the dam. Others followed, recounting their own run-ins with Eleanor, stories of intimidation, questionable financial decisions, and bullying tactics long ignored or suppressed. But Eleanor wasn't done. That same night, the security cameras Jason had recently installed captured a shocking scene. Eleanor herself directing a small crew with construction equipment, attempting to bulldoze a section of the disputed access road. The intent was clear: cause permanent damage before I could assert full control. Jason alerted the sheriff's department, and deputies arrived on the scene in time to stop the destruction. Eleanor was arrested for criminal property damage and violating a court order. The footage of her screaming at deputies vowing to bury this whole development before letting that Collins boy win aired on local news the next morning, further cementing her fall from grace. In an emergency session the following day, the HOA board officially removed Eleanor as president. Howard Pierce, formerly silent, now came forward with damning testimony. Eleanor, he said, had ordered him to make the problem go away by any means necessary. With public pressure mounting and the scandal growing, county officials launched a broader investigation. Their findings were devastating. Eleanor had bribed local inspectors. She'd filed falsified environmental impact reports. Most damning of all, she had orchestrated the illegal relocation of survey markers, moving them at night to falsify the boundaries of my land and deceive regulators and residents alike. As the criminal case expanded, a new face stepped forward. Ironically, Jason Kent, now serving as acting HOA president, he approached me with a proposal. We were never your enemies, he said. Most of us didn't know what Eleanor was really doing. We're just families trying to protect our homes. The settlement offer included a substantial financial payment for the harassment I'd endured, permanent easement rights to ensure unfettered access to my property, and a promise to restore all damaged areas to their original condition. Before responding, I reviewed the full development plans. Eleanor had filed a document now in the custody of investigators. What I found was worse than I imagined. Her commercial project wouldn't just impact my land, it threatened the entire watershed. Her plans called for draining the wetlands that fed the small lake on my property. Doing so would devastate the local ecosystem and create serious flood risks for dozens of nearby homes during periods of heavy rain. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore, it was an environmental crisis waiting to happen. I realized the choice before me wasn't simply about retribution or compensation. It was about the future of Valley View and whether I'd use my newfound power to settle a score, or to protect something bigger than myself. The next morning, as mist curled off the lake's surface, I stood on my grandmother's land and thought about what she would have done. I now held legal control over critical sections of Valley View Estates. The community had turned its back on me on Sia, but now, their fate rested in my hands. It was time to decide, revenge or restoration? After deep reflection, I called a meeting with the new HOA board, local environmental experts, and Carmen Washington, the journalist who had helped expose it all. Carmen Washington's reporting had played a vital role in uncovering the truth. As I addressed the gathered group, I made my intentions clear. I have no interest in holding your homes hostage, I said, but there are 3 non-negotiable conditions for returning control of the common areas to Valley View. The first, the establishment of a permanent conservation easement, and not just for my land, but for the entire interconnected wetland system. It would ensure that no future development could drain the watershed or damage the ecosystem my grandmother had spent her life protecting. The second, architectural and access rights for my new home, guaranteed in writing. No future HOA would ever be able to isolate or harass my property again. The third, the creation of a neighborhood oversight committee with real, binding authority, a democratic safeguard to prevent any one person from ever wielding the unchecked power Eleanor once held. After some negotiation, the board unanimously agreed. The relief in the room was palpable. They'd expected vengeance. Instead, they got accountability and a second chance. The wetlands were saved, the lake was protected, and in place of the division Eleanor had fostered, we planted trees and began to heal. Slowly, what had once been seen as a liability became the soul of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Eleanor's downfall continued. Investigations into her past developments revealed a troubling pattern. She was eventually charged with fraud, bribery of public officials, and environmental crimes. The court ordered her to pay restitution to all affected homeowners, including me, but the financial penalties paled in comparison to the destruction of her reputation. She left the state in disgrace. Her dreams of becoming a prominent regional developer utterly destroyed. Howard Pierce, who had come forward with key testimony, received immunity for his lesser involvement. In retirement, he founded a legal aid group focused on protecting homeowners from predatory developers, a quiet atonement for his role in the scandal. With the legal battles behind me and funds from both the settlement and Eleanor's restitution, I finally began construction on a home of my own. It was a modest cottage, built in harmony with the land rather than over it. The most important feature, a new rose garden, planted with cuttings from my grandmother's original flowers, carefully preserved for this moment. As the roses took root, I thought often of her. The way she had quietly, deliberately planted legal protections with the same care she gave her garden. Her foresight hadn't just preserved our land, it preserved our connection to it. The now famous deed clause that turned the tide became a local legend. Law students studied it, lawyers cited it. It became known as a masterclass in defending property rights. Perhaps the most surprising legacy was the transformation of Valley View's relationship with my land. What once divided us now brought us together. The conservation area attracted birdwatchers and environmental educators. Local schools began bringing students to learn about ecosystems and sustainability. Longtime residents who had once viewed my property as an obstacle began to see it as something sacred, as something that made the community special. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very land Eleanor tried to erase had become the defining feature of Valley View Estates. Eventually, the county adopted new regulations and unofficially called the Collins Property Rights Act. These laws mandated more transparency in development, stricter boundary verification, and earlier notification to affected landowners. Carmen's continued reporting helped bring awareness and build support for the reforms. Sarah Rodriguez, the sharp young attorney who first took my case, became something of a celebrity in property rights circles. She dedicated her career to helping individuals stand up to powerful developers. She often cited my story as the turning point. A year after the court's ruling, I hosted a community picnic on my land. Children played by the lake shore where I once fished with my grandmother. Residents mingled with environmentalists and students. Jason, now firmly established as HOA president, presented me with a plaque honoring the courage and vision that had turned a conflict into a community. As the sun set over the lake, I stood in quiet reflection, remembering the long road that had brought us here. This fight was never just about land or legacy. It was about honoring a deeper truth, our connection to the natural world and to the wisdom of those who came before us. In my office, I keep two framed items on the wall. One is the deed clause that saved everything. The other is a photo of my grandmother standing in her rose garden, her face gentle yet unshakably strong. Together, they remind me that the most important boundaries aren't drawn on maps. They're drawn in principally in the courage to stand firm, the foresight to protect what matters, and the will to preserve something for those yet to come. Each spring, as her roses bloom around my new home, I know she would approve of how her final lesson took root and flourished.